December 19th, 1944. Ardennes Forest, Belgium. Snow fell like ash over a road that refused to die. In the bitter cold of Europe's last great battle, the rumble of engines echoed between skeletal trees. Headlights cut through fog, revealing endless convoys of olive-drab trucks crawling toward the front. Their tires groaned in frozen mud. Their drivers, young, sleepless Americans, hunched over steering wheels wrapped in cloth, guiding 10,000 tons of life through a world of ice and silence. Behind them, warehouses emptied. Ahead, divisions starved of fuel and ammunition. Between them, one fragile line of motion. The trucks carried a quiet signature, the letters GMC, etched into the steel of every 2.5-ton workhorse that powered the Allied advance. Once dismissed as too heavy, too slow, too impractical for war, they now carried everything that kept an army alive: fuel, shells, rations, and hope. The sound of their engines was the pulse of the Allied war machine. And before the snow melted, those wheels would prove that America's greatest weapon wasn't built to kill. It was built to carry victory. In the late 1930s, the United States Army faced a quiet crisis, one not measured in guns or men, but in motion. Its soldiers could march, its artillery could fire, but its armies could not move. For all its size and industry, America entered the dawn of World War II with a problem older than the Great War itself: logistics. The U.S. Army of 1939 was still a force of horses, wagons, and scattered truck models, a patchwork fleet that broke down as often as it rolled. When the first war clouds gathered over Europe, only a handful of officers in the Ordnance Department truly understood what modern war would demand: engines, tires, and a vehicle that could carry supplies across any terrain on Earth. The challenge was simple to describe, impossible to execute. The Army needed a truck light enough to cross rickety bridges, strong enough to haul 3 tons of cargo, and versatile enough to be built by the hundreds of thousands. But in 1939, no such truck existed. American motor companies were willing to experiment, but none wanted to sacrifice production lines for a design the military itself could not define. The U.S. Quartermaster Corps had one answer: a standardized 2.5-ton, 6-wheel drive cargo truck. A vehicle that could serve every branch of the service, from the frozen Aleutians to the deserts of North Africa. It was a radical idea, standardization on a national scale, and few believed it could work. At the time, most European armies used specialized vehicles for each purpose: artillery tractors, troop carriers, tank transporters. Germany's Wehrmacht, though mechanized, was chained to complex and fragile designs that demanded constant maintenance. The American proposal was the opposite: one truck for everything. It sounded like bureaucratic fantasy. General Motors Corporation's subsidiary, Yellow Truck and Coach, took the challenge. Their engineers sketched a prototype with a 6x6 drive system, a 270 cubic-inch inline-6 engine, and a simple, box-like body that could be modified for any role: fuel tanker, troop carrier, radio van, or ambulance. The Army inspectors weren't impressed. The vehicle, they said, looked too commercial, its frame too light, and its suspension unsuitable for combat. By the end of 1940, only a few hundred had been built. Some were quietly tested at Fort Benning and Camp Holabird. They slipped through mud, stalled on inclines, cracked their axles. Reports came back brutal: unreliable, unfit, worthless. Yet the engineers kept refining it. They reinforced the frame, added a transfer case for full 6-wheel drive, and strengthened the cargo bed. The truck became the GMC CCKW, a string of letters meaning cargo, conventional cab, all-wheel drive, short wheelbase. It was still not glamorous, not armored, not fast, but it worked. Then came 1941, and the war that would need every wheel America could build. When Japan attacked Pearl Harbor and Germany declared war on the United States, the American arsenal was suddenly the arsenal of democracy. And democracy needed trucks. Tanks could win battles, but trucks would win the war. Within months, the GMC plants in Pontiac, Michigan, and Chevrolet factories in St. Louis converted to round-the-clock production. The same machine that had been dismissed as worthless rolled off assembly lines in the tens of thousands. Civilians who had once built sedans were now riveting frames, welding axles, and bolting canvas canopies onto olive-drab skeletons of steel. The Allies were beginning to learn that power was not only measured in firepower, it was measured in throughput. 1 million gallons of fuel meant nothing if it couldn't reach the front. And by the time the first American convoys landed in North Africa, those unglamorous trucks were waiting on the docks, engines idling beneath desert sun, ready to prove their worth. When the Allied invasion of North Africa began in November 1942, the trucks that had once struggled through U.S. test fields were suddenly the backbone of Operation Torch. Across the blazing desert, from Algiers to Kasserine, the newly standardized trucks hauled ammunition, fuel, and rations over terrain no engineer had designed for. In these first campaigns, the American Army learned 2 lessons at once: the power of industry and the fragility of logistics. Roads vanished beneath drifting sand, radiators boiled dry, axles cracked. Yet the trucks endured. Crude, loud, and astonishingly dependable. Soldiers nicknamed them Deuces. Mechanics learned to rebuild engines from salvaged parts. A driver in Tunisia could find a replacement for almost anything because nearly every truck on the continent was built from the same parts bin. That uniformity became the quiet genius of the design. A single spark plug, a single axle shaft, a single brake drum fit every model. In war, that meant speed. By mid-1943, American convoys moved supplies with a rhythm the enemy could not match. Each port captured by the Allies, Oran, Bizerte, Naples, became a living artery of motion. Every crate, shell, and ration bar traveled by the same workhorse truck. The Axis called it the Ghost Fleet, because it seemed to appear everywhere, filling roads that had been empty the day before. When the fighting shifted to Europe, that Ghost Fleet followed. The invasion of Normandy in June 1944 unleashed the largest logistical operation in history. Behind the assault waves, behind every Sherman tank and infantry battalion, came the convoys. They landed on beaches under fire, drove through wreckage, and kept rolling. The secret of victory wasn't just courage, it was continuity. While German divisions relied on horse-drawn wagons for nearly 80% of their supply lines, the Americans had mechanized their entire army. Each of those plain green trucks represented the difference between a stalled offensive and an unstoppable one. Detroit became an arsenal of wheels. General Motors, Chevrolet, and Studebaker built over 812,000 units before the war's end. Every 9 minutes, another truck left an assembly line, identical to the last. The same vehicle that carried infantry through Sicily would soon carry fuel through France, and later, refugees through a liberated Europe. By late 1944, the trucks had become so essential that commanders designed operations around them. General Dwight D. Eisenhower later admitted that the humble cargo truck was one of the 6 most vital weapons of the war. Still, their greatest test was yet to come. As Allied spearheads broke through Normandy and raced across France, the very success of that advance threatened to outpace its supply lines. Fuel ran short, ammunition stocks fell dangerously low, and suddenly, the miracle of mechanization faced its greatest weakness: distance. In that crisis, America's worthless truck would achieve legend. The answer to the supply problem would not come from new weapons or strategy, but from pure endurance. Men and machines driving without rest, forming a lifeline across liberated Europe. It would be called the Red Ball Express, a name that would define logistics for generations. The story of that operation and how it transformed the unglamorous truck into a symbol of victory is where the legend truly began. By the summer of 1944, as Allied armies surged across France, the difference between victory and collapse rested on wheels. The front moved so quickly that railroads couldn't keep up. Fuel depots lagged hundreds of miles behind, and ammunition dumps were emptying faster than they could be refilled. That's when the United States Army created a new kind of fighting force, a mobile supply system that would feed the war's momentum mile by mile. It was called the Red Ball Express, named after the Red Circular, insignia painted on its vehicles, and borrowed from American railroad slang for high priority. Freight, the convoy became the most famous logistical operation in military history. At its height, the Red Ball Express operated over 6,000 trucks on a 700-kilometer route from Normandy to the front lines in Belgium. They drove day and night, headlights blacked out, following a one-way loop of dust, mud, and exhaustion. Each truck carried 5 tons of supplies. Every 2.5 minutes, another rolled out. The lifeblood of that operation was the GMC truck. Rugged, repairable, and predictable. Its simple 6x6 drivetrain could crawl through fields where tanks bogged down. Its cargo bed could hold anything: jerry cans, shells, spare engines, even wounded men on stretchers. The men behind the wheel were often young, undertrained, and exhausted, but their resilience matched the machines. Nearly 75% of Red Ball drivers were African-American soldiers, serving in segregated units that rarely received recognition. Their work was dangerous. Mechanical failures, enemy strafing, and sheer fatigue claimed hundreds of lives. Yet they kept driving. They called themselves the guys who deliver the goods. And they did 12,500 tons a day. Every major offensive from Paris to the Rhine ran on their courage. When the fuel lines broke down, when armored spearheads stalled, these drivers risked their lives to bring gasoline to the front. A single missed convoy could silence an entire division. To them, the truck was more than a vehicle. It was a partner. It rattled, smoked, and shook loose its bolts. But it rarely failed. Mechanics learned to swap engines in hours. Tires, soaked in mud, were patched with rubber cut from other wrecks. In every field workshop, from Cherbourg to Bastogne, the same phrase echoed, "Keep the Deuce rolling." While newspapers celebrated bombers and tanks, the real miracle of mobility came from these convoys. Unarmed, unarmored, and unstoppable. They were the veins of an industrial organism unlike anything the world had seen before. The mechanized might of the United States feeding an entire continent. And while German intelligence mapped divisions and airfields, it failed to understand that America's true weapon wasn't on the front line. It was the line itself. While the Red Ball Express showed what logistics could do under fire, the truck itself told a deeper story, one of design, simplicity, and endurance. The GMC truck wasn't elegant. It wasn't fast. It didn't inspire fear like a tank or awe like a bomber. Yet, its very ordinariness made it revolutionary. Every bolt, hinge, and gear reflected a design philosophy that defined American industry in the 1940s. Build it simple, build it strong, build it everywhere. The truck's straight-six engine produced just over 90 horsepower, less than some German staff cars, but it could pull 3 tons of cargo across mud, snow, and stone. Its gearbox was so forgiving that soldiers could learn to drive it in a day. When broken, almost every part could be swapped with another. In a war famous for its technological leaps, the CCKW's greatest innovation was that it never needed one. This was no accident. In 1942, engineers at GMC and the U.S. Ordnance Department set a rule that would change military production forever. No redesigns during war, unless absolutely necessary. That meant a soldier who climbed into a truck in 1942 would find the same dashboard, engine layout, and axle placement as one who climbed in during 1945. That predictability created efficiency. It meant any mechanic could repair any truck, anywhere in the world. It meant parts shipped from Detroit fit perfectly onto vehicles in Italy or Burma. It meant victory by repetition. Across the ocean, the Axis faced the opposite problem. German industry, fractured by rival agencies and design bureaus, built a labyrinth of vehicles, dozens of models with incompatible parts. A truck destroyed outside Kursk couldn't be repaired with parts from a truck in France. As fuel dwindled and bombers shattered factories, German mobility died not in battle, but in bureaucracy. In contrast, American soldiers joked that their trucks could eat anything and keep going. They filled engines with low-grade gasoline, patched radiators with tin cans, and drove through rivers meant for boats. The design was so resilient that the Soviets, receiving thousands through Lend-Lease, called it the American camel. But beyond the mechanics lay a human truth. The truck changed the rhythm of war. No longer did armies depend on fixed rail lines or horse columns. They could improvise, adapt, and move faster than any enemy could predict. This flexibility, what Eisenhower later called mobility warfare, became the Allied signature. On the front lines, that mobility meant survival. Trucks delivered not just ammunition and food, but mail from home, medical supplies, even instruments for field bands. Soldiers began to associate the sound of those engines with hope, the assurance that no matter how far they advanced, America would be right behind them, mile after mile. The worthless truck had become a symbol of modern war's invisible power. Logistics as destiny. And in the coming winter of 1944, that destiny would be tested to its absolute limit. December 1944, the Ardennes Offensive. The roads that had once carried victory now became death traps. The German army, in a desperate gamble, launched its final major offensive of the war, the Battle of the Bulge. Under freezing skies, Hitler threw 500,000 men and more than 1,000 tanks into the forests of Belgium and Luxembourg. The surprise attack shattered Allied lines, surrounded entire units, and threatened to split the Western Front in two. For the Americans, everything depended on one thing: keeping the front supplied. Fuel was the first crisis. The German plan relied on capturing Allied fuel depots. Their tanks would run until the last captured gallon. Eisenhower's commanders, realizing the danger, ordered every drop of fuel moved immediately. That meant the convoys, the same trucks that had driven for months without rest, had to roll again, this time through ice, snow, and enemy artillery. The Red Ball Express had been officially disbanded weeks earlier, its mission declared complete after the liberation of France. But now, out of sheer necessity, it was reborn. Convoys of trucks snaked through mountain passes under blackout conditions. Snow packed in their wheel wells, diesel froze in tanks, and engines howled in protest. Yet they kept moving, because if they stopped, the entire front would die. From Verdun to Bastogne, those trucks became lifelines. When the 101st Airborne Division was surrounded, when tank columns ran dry, it was the same worthless trucks that clawed through blizzards to reach them. Drivers navigated by feel, headlights off, guided only by faint markers or the red glow of the truck ahead. Men wrapped rags around their boots to fight frostbite. Some never made it. Convoys were shelled, ambushed, or lost to the cold. But still, they drove. Theirs was not glory, but endurance. General George S. Patton, whose Third Army raced north to relieve Bastogne, later credited those trucks with saving his offensive. "My men can eat their belts," he growled, "but my tanks have got to have gas." Within days, convoys delivered more than 400,000 gallons of fuel under enemy fire, enough to keep Patton's tanks rolling and the German offensive collapsing. At Bastogne, artillery fire shattered roads, bridges froze, and supply lines vanished. Except for the trucks, soldiers waiting in trenches swore they could recognize the sound of an approaching convoy before they could see it. That low, coughing growl of 6 wheels fighting through ice. Each arrival brought more than supplies. It brought proof that the line would hold. By the final week of December, the Allies had reversed the tide. German tanks, starved of fuel, ground to a halt. Infantry froze in the snow. What had begun as Hitler's last gamble ended as his army's last disaster. And through it all, the same rugged trucks carried the war on their backs, proving once again that steel and stamina could defeat even the most desperate strategy. In the silence that followed, the convoys parked by the roadside, engines ticking in the cold, their crews asleep behind the wheel. They had done the impossible. But victory in the Ardennes was only half the story. What came next would prove just how far the worthless truck had carried not just supplies, but the very idea of Allied victory itself. When the snow began to melt in early January 1945, the Ardennes looked like the wreckage of an empire. Burned-out tanks littered the roads. Artillery pieces lay twisted in ditches. Whole villages had vanished under bombardment. But threading through the ruin were still the tire tracks, the frozen veins of the convoys that had never stopped. From the sky, reconnaissance pilots reported something astonishing: the constant motion of Allied supply lines. Even during the fiercest fighting, the roads behind the front were alive. Hundreds of trucks still moved day and night, forming the rhythm of recovery. The enemy had gambled everything on cutting those arteries, and failed. What began as improvisation had become infrastructure. Military engineers reinforced bridges with Bailey spans just strong enough to handle the weight of the Deuce-and-a-Half. Snowplows, many built from the same trucks with blades welded on, cleared the roads. Fuel depots, once scattered, now operated on synchronized schedules. The Red Ball's legacy had become a doctrine: mobility as a weapon. General Eisenhower later told his staff that victory at the Bulge had been decided as much by the motor pool as by the rifle. That was not rhetoric. When the German offensive collapsed, it was the convoys that surged forward first, carrying food for liberated civilians, ammunition for counterattacks, and medicine for the wounded. One photograph, taken near Houffalize in January 1945, captured it perfectly: a column of trucks grinding uphill through fog, canvas tops sagging with snow, a hand-painted sign nailed to a tree. "Keep 'em rolling!" In those 3 words lay the story of an entire industrial civilization at war. America's greatest strength wasn't its tanks, its generals, or even its manpower. It was the ability to move, to project energy, material, and willpower across oceans and continents without pause. Every Allied advance after the Ardennes depended on that motion. The crossing of the Rhine, the liberation of the Netherlands, the final push into Germany. All of it followed the same green convoys that had survived the winter. Soldiers joked that if they ever stopped hearing the rumble of engines behind them, the war itself would freeze. The Germans understood it too. Captured officers spoke bitterly about the endless supply lines. One described the trucks as rolling factories of war. Another admitted that their army had never fought an enemy that could move the battlefield faster than it could think. By April 1945, when the Allied armies reached the Elbe River, the trucks had logged more than 700 million miles. They had outlasted snow, mud, and shell fire. They had delivered everything an army could need, and nothing it could live without. The soldiers who drove them didn't see themselves as heroes. They were mechanics, clerks, farmers' sons. Men who learned that victory wasn't always about taking ground, but about holding motion. When Germany finally surrendered in May, many of those trucks were still running, oil-stained, dented, their dashboards marked with pencil notes of every run. Some would carry refugees home. Others would serve in Korea, in reconstruction, or on farms that had once been battlefields. The worthless truck had done what no weapon could. It carried civilization forward through the ruins of war. When the guns finally fell silent in May 1945, Europe lay in ruins, but America's engines were still running. The same trucks that had dragged victory through mud and snow now became the foundation of rebuilding. In the first weeks after Germany's surrender, U.S. Army convoys no longer carried ammunition or fuel. Their cargo changed. Now it was food, medicine, and hope. From Le Havre to Hamburg, from Antwerp to Munich, the same trucks that once thundered toward battle now rolled quietly through shattered towns, delivering bread to civilians and hauling refugees to safety. American soldiers called it Operation Handshake. Local children called the trucks the Green Giants. Wherever they arrived, people gathered to watch, not out of fear, but disbelief. The same machine that had symbolized conquest now brought survival. In logistical reports compiled by the U.S. Army Service Forces that summer, the numbers were staggering. By VE Day, the U.S. had produced more than 812,000 GMC 212-ton trucks, accounting for nearly one-fifth of all military vehicles built during the war. Together, they had hauled over 3 billion tons of supplies, from ammunition and gasoline to medical kits and even Christmas mail. Each truck averaged 12 miles per gallon, yet collectively they consumed nearly 1 billion gallons of fuel. A reminder of the industrial colossus that stood behind every frontline soldier. The Army estimated that if the trucks had stopped moving for even 48 hours in Europe, the entire Allied advance would have halted. In post-war debriefings, generals named 6 weapons that had won the war: the Jeep, the Dakota transport aircraft, the Higgins landing craft, the atomic bomb, the bazooka, and the GMC-2 1-2-ton truck. Eisenhower himself placed it alongside the Jeep and the C-47 as one of the tools of victory. The trucks that survived the war found second lives. Thousands were sold as surplus, scattered across continents. In France, farmers converted them into tractors. In Italy, they became buses, ambulances, and moving workshops. In Norway and Denmark, they pulled timber from forests. In the Philippines and Japan, they helped rebuild roads destroyed by bombing. Even behind the Iron Curtain, Soviet engineers who had received thousands through Lend-Lease studied the design carefully. They copied its suspension, drivetrain, and engine layout to build their own post-war vehicles. A quiet admission that America's worthless truck had become the new world standard. In the U.S. itself, many veterans bought their old trucks back from government auctions. Painted in civilian colors, they rumbled along American highways, hauling lumber and grain, their engines still carrying the faint smell of war oil and victory dust. The machine that had once carried an army had become part of ordinary life again, just as its designers intended. Yet even amid peace, its story wasn't over. The post-war world that these trucks helped build would soon call on them again, this time under a different flag. In a different war, across an ocean once more divided by ideology. By the time the Korean War erupted in June 1950, the world had changed, but the trucks had not. In the mountains of the Korean peninsula, under monsoon rain and artillery fire, the same GMC workhorses returned to service. They climbed muddy ridges, crossed shattered bridges, and hauled supplies through terrain that destroyed modern vehicles. Mechanics called them veterans of 2 wars. 5 years after the end of World War II, the truck's simplicity was still its greatest weapon. Spare parts from 1944 fit perfectly onto trucks built in 1950. In a conflict where new technology often failed under field conditions, the CCKW remained the one machine soldiers trusted without question. In an official U.S. Army quartermaster report from 1952, an officer wrote, "No other single vehicle has delivered so much, to so many, for so long." After Korea, the trucks spread even further. Nations rebuilt under the Marshall Plan received thousands of them. In Greece, they hauled reconstruction materials through mountain villages. In France and Italy, they became the backbone of new national transport fleets. In Japan, they were repurposed for public works and civil defense. The legacy extended far beyond machinery. For millions, these trucks became the first symbols of American industry. Mobile proof of a nation's capacity to build not only for war, but for renewal. They turned the word logistics from a military concept into a philosophy of civilization itself. Even as technology advanced, the truck's design left its imprint everywhere. Engineers studying post-war mobility traced nearly every NATO transport standard back to the CCKW layout, the six-wheel drive, the chassis balance, the modular cargo body. Its DNA could be seen in later icons, the M35 Deuce-and-a-Half, the M939 series, and even modern tactical logistics vehicles in museums today, from Fort Lee, Virginia, to the Imperial War Museum in Duxford. Restored CCKWs stand quietly beside tanks and aircraft. Visitors rarely stop for long. It lacks the glamour of the Mustang or the menace of the Tiger. But to those who understand war, its presence speaks louder than any gun. A faded stencil still marks the side of one truck in Normandy. Red Ball Express, 1944. Its olive drab paint is chipped, its tires cracked, but its story endures. It reminds us that the war was not only won by heroes in cockpits or trenches, but by the relentless rhythm of ordinary men and machines that refused to stop moving. For every mile of advance, there was a driver who didn't sleep, a mechanic who didn't eat, a truck that didn't quit. And when historians write about victory, they find, again and again, that behind every triumph stood something simple, loud, and unstoppable. A truck once dismissed as worthless, that became the spine of a world rebuilt. In every war, there are machines built to destroy, and a few built to endure. The truck belonged to the second kind. It never fired a shot, never appeared on a propaganda poster, and never had a song written about it. Yet without it, victory would have been impossible. It was the sound that connected the front to the homeland, the steady hum that said, "We're still moving." On the battlefield, that meant life. In peacetime, it meant renewal. It carried not just men and material, but a nation's industrial spirit, the belief that ingenuity, repetition, and discipline could move mountains faster than any weapon. When soldiers remembered the war, they spoke of the cold, the dust, the endless roads, and the trucks that never quit. To them, the smell of gasoline and canvas became the scent of survival. It was the proof that even in chaos, order could be built from steel and persistence. The worthless design that no one wanted became the backbone of every Allied victory, and later, the bridge between a ruined world and the one that rose from its ashes. In the end, history often crowns the glamorous, the generals, the aircraft, the breakthroughs, but beneath them all lies a quieter truth. Wars are won not only by courage, but by motion, by the relentless grind of wheels that refuse to stop turning. And long after the last engine fell silent, the legacy of those trucks remained, not as relics of war, but as monuments to endurance, because sometimes the greatest triumphs are carried not on wings or tracks, but on wheels.